They sat on their bunk bed, holding hands tightly in the darkness. They waited. They lost track of time. But when Rosalie felt her eyelids growing heavy, she knew it must be late. And in that instant, as she fought with herself to stay awake, the first thump came. Welcome to Stories of Futures Past, written when 50 years ago was in the future. Today I present to you Lights Out for Rosalie by Ethel G. Lewis, published in 1956. In this story, we are invited into the young couple Rosalie Miller and her husband Bob, the science teacher's happy home. She is going slightly spare, stuck in the tiny apartment as she is, and food keeps disappearing from the fridge. Then things go thump in the night. Enjoy. Lights Out for Rosalie by Ethel G. Lewis, originally published in Fantastic Universe, June 1956.
Narrated by Tom Trussell. When Rosalie Miller first broached the subject of the disappearing food to her husband, she was carefully tactful. They had been married for only 10 months, and the rites of tenderness, consideration, and love names were still zealously performed without self-conscious effort. An instructor in science to a freshman college class, Bob Miller disliked being interrupted when he was marking examination papers. There was a huge pile of such papers in front of him now, and Rosalie tentatively cleared her throat. "Darling," she said. "Hmm?" He did not lift his head, but his brows contracted slightly. "Oh, I know this sounds stingy, darling, but our budget really won't stand it, you know." Bob Miller looked up suddenly. "You sound so serious," he said, his face still set in concentration. "What I mean is—" She broke off guiltily, remembering how lovingly he had kissed her when she had come home late that afternoon. She had to force herself to go on. "Bobby dear, if you get hungry at night, couldn't you just take a drink of water instead?" A smile began to tug at the serious lines of his mouth. "Instead of what, honey bun?" he asked. "Instead of raiding the refrigerator, darling. I had intended that leftover hamburger for tonight's dinner. When I found you'd eaten it, I had to buy a can of salmon. Salmon isn't exactly cheap these days either." Bob shook his dark head, the look in his eyes going very soft for an instant. "You're knocking at the wrong door, baby," he said. "I didn't raid the refrigerator. I slept without waking once last night." "Oh," Rosalie said, her eyes wide and incredulous. Why was Bob lying? He had never lied to her before. He could so easily have said he wouldn't do it again. "Well, I didn't either," she said in a whisper. And the next instant, agitated because she was whispering, she raised her voice. "One of us had to." "Spooks," Bob said, grinning. "Now, Ginger, let Papa do his homework, will you?" She loved his calling her names like Ginger, Honeybun, and Baby. What if he did persist in denying that he had eaten up the leftovers? Maybe he ate in his sleep, just as some people walked in theirs. The idea amused her, and she tried to shake off her preoccupation with the mysterious disappearance of the food. "But," she began, in spite of her resolve. Bob's face went stern once more. "I have to finish these papers. As you well know, my dearest helpmate, on a morrow as inevitable as the sunrise, I'll have to cope with these no-heads, otherwise called students. So let me finish my job before we talk or play riddles, okay?" He lowered his head once more, and Rosalie sat looking at him in silence, her feelings working themselves into an inchoate mass. She was 22, and she looked up to and respected her husband, because he was 29 and had gone a little grey at the temples and had lost 3 years of his life in the Pacific during World War II. Also, she loved him. He had been one of the last of the veteran students at the university where she was majoring in psych. He was her dream man come to life, and she had felt like shouting with pride when he carried off the 2 most coveted prizes in science, and modestly refrained from crowing about it. They were already very much in love, and planning to marry when the assistant professorship was offered to him. The salary was small, but he called her his lady luck, as well as a luscious babe with brains. With high hopes that they could have a fine marriage, they brought an abundance of mutual desire to their union, and things had up until now been going quite well. It was to their credit, she told herself, that they were still in love despite several months of cramped living in this crowded little place. They had set up housekeeping in her apartment in order to save enough money to buy a small ranch house a mere 30 minutes' drive from the college. So, all the home they had known was what she humorously termed their common room, a 15 by 13 area in which they spent their waking hours, eating, reading, kissing, and talking. There was an alcove with a built-in bed for sleeping, over by the window. In 6 short steps they could cross to a tiny space imaginatively called a kitchen, which boasted a window which opened on a fire escape. A bathroom with all of the requisite fixtures in a minimal amount of space completed the blissful marital arrangement. But they seemed not to get in each other's way, and now as her reverie ended, Rosalie pulled her thoughts up sharply. A successful marriage had to be worked at persistently, she told herself. Bob was busy, and it was up to her to drop a subject that could lead to controversy. She must have forgotten eating the hamburger for her own lunch. If Bob was not lying, there was no other possible explanation. She began to yawn and decided to get ready for bed. Beyond a wink from Bob at the precise instant when she slid in between the sheets and looked toward him longingly, there was no more between them that night. The next evening, however, Rosalie found herself bringing the subject up again. She had no choice, she told herself, fighting the crazy thunder of her heart and feeling almost physically ill. "Darling," she said, "I must talk to you." Bob was reading, but he glanced up at once, his finger wedged securely in a vital section of the book. "Yes, honey bun," he said. "I never hear you get up, I won't deny that," she said. "But if you're hungry at night, couldn't you munch a carrot?" "What, again?" Bob almost shouted. He had never shouted at her before. Now, quite visibly, his face got red. "Girl, you've got an obsession. Haven't I assured you I never go in for raiding the refrigerator? Not even when I was a lad in the wilds of Brooklyn did I raid a refrigerator. Look, baby." He smiled and leaned forward. "What is all this about, anyhow?" "I'm getting scared," she confessed. "Somebody is eating up our food." For a moment there was silence, and then Bob closed the book. He stood up. With tender solicitude he went to her, bent and kissed her lips. "Maybe you ought to see a doctor," he said anxiously. It was her turn to become indignant. "Are you telling me I'm not mentally fit?" she demanded. Bob began to laugh. He took a few steps and then looked at her smilingly. "We've got a built-in gremlin or a Martian or something," he said. She could not afterwards name the exact moment when the fear came to birth inside her. She only knew that it was a corrosive emotion. She should have perhaps understood it better, since she had majored in psych and had been an A student. "Could you—" She stopped, swallowed, and then continued. "Darling, could you have concocted a creature out of that blob of protoplasm you've got under study?" "Creature?" Bob shook his head, smiling broadly. "I couldn't concoct a worm from what I've been messing around with, and I haven't been near the lab for weeks." The laboratory was in the bathroom, and calling it a lab was one of their private jokes. For want of a better working arrangement in the apartment, Bob had placed a narrow shelf on 2 metal brackets over the bathtub. When you stood up in the tub, the shelf was about chest high. They had learned not to bump their heads on it when getting out of the tub, and they had been especially careful since a certain night 2 weeks before, when Bob had become momentarily forgetful. He had hit his head hard and had upset the paraphernalia. At first Bob swore, but after cleaning up had decided that nothing was missing and that no real harm had been done. He had reassembled the apparatus, and they had both forgotten the incident. That, Rosalie now realized with sudden dread, had been their mistake. They ought not to have forgotten about Bob's knocking over the shelf. Something had escaped from his test tube. She sprang to her feet and ran to her husband, whose arms went quickly around her. "I'm scared. Oh, Bob, something did get lost." "What are you talking about?" he demanded. His hands tightened on her shoulders, and then, suddenly, she felt the fear begin in him too. "How long has this disappearing food act been going on?" he asked in a low voice. "About a week, I think," she told him. "I hated to say anything to you." "A prowler might be getting in through the kitchen window," he said, his gaze travelling toward the kitchenette space. There was no real conviction in his voice. She swallowed hard against the great lump that was rising in her throat. "But, darling, you lock that window every night. I see you. I watch you lock that window every single night, and there's never been any broken glass. If anyone wanted to get in, he'd simply have to break the window, and, darling, we would hear." Her voice stopped abruptly. What frightened her now was the fact of Bob's fear. When she looked up at him, the paleness of his face shocked her. As if dazed, he was shaking his head. "It just couldn't be," he muttered, glancing in the direction of the bathroom. And then, explosively, he cried out, "Let's get out of here, Rosie." He caught her against him, so close that she could feel the shudders running through his body. "My God," he said over her head, pressing her face against him in a gesture of protectiveness. "My God!" And now there was no explosiveness in his voice, but only a terrified incredulity. She forced herself to ask against the rising constriction in her throat, "When you bumped into the lab, something got away and concealed itself somewhere, didn't it, Bob? Didn't it?" Her voice was turning into a scream. He quieted a little as her fear intensified his desire to protect and reassure her. "Steady," he urged. "Steady, honey bun. Something happened, apparently. I didn't believe anything would. I had given the thing. It was the size of a pinpoint. A shot. Call it a hormone extract. What does a name matter? The shot could have activated the specimen. A new gimmick. I didn't really believe in it. I considered it to be a long shot. He groaned, holding her more tightly. And that's the part that was missing when I picked up the lab. I hadn't even given it a thought. His breath was terrible to hear as he tried to control it. He might have been running a long, harrowing race. "Stay right where you are," he said suddenly. "I'm going to look for it." He began a crazy, unthinking search, involving much noise and a total upheaval in the apartment, with every bit of furniture overturned. He even went down on his hands and knees and looked under the sink, the stove, the cupboards. A broom clattered on the floor as he pulled open a narrow closet which housed a dustbin as well. The dustbin he overturned. In a fever of movement, he did not stop until he had scrutinized every inch of the floor and thrown wide every closed space. And then, in utter exhaustion, he turned to his wife. "Come on, we're not staying." Rosalie felt herself to be more ice than flesh and blood. "We can't," she said. "We'd wander for the rest of our lives, and you would never again have the courage to attempt another experiment. It couldn't be big enough to hurt us, Bob. How could it be?" She leaned toward him, her eyes pleading with him. "It would have to be small." He shook his head grimly, tugging at his hair with one hand. "I don't know. Rosie, I honestly don't know what size it may have reached in the 10 days it has been free. I did it for fun. I never even secured data on it." He caught her to him again, muttering in bitter self-reproach. "Fool, fool, criminal fool!" She felt resolve harden within her. "We'll make a test," she said slowly. "There was a chicken leg left over from dinner. We'll put out the lights. We'll wait." They sat on their bunk bed, holding hands tightly in the darkness. They waited. They lost track of time, but when Rosalie felt her eyelids growing heavy, she knew it must be late. And in that instant, as she fought with herself to stay awake, the first thump came. She counted the thumps as Bob's fingers closed convulsively on hers. There were 8 rhythmic thuds, and then the sound of the refrigerator door swinging open. Next came the sound of the door closing. 8 thumps followed, and then nothing but silence, with a gasp of their own breathing to heighten the horror of not knowing. Bob stood up. "I'm going in there and have a look," he said. She sprang to his side, and they moved step by step toward the kitchen. Bob switched on the overhead light. Then, his jaw muscles twitching, he pulled open the refrigerator door, and Rosalie looked in. The chicken leg was gone. Bob slammed the door shut and caught her to him. "Come on," he shouted. But now she had only one overmastering dread, that she would see the thing. She turned off the overhead light and would not move when Bob tried to propel her forward. The sounds began again. The first thump came from the direction of the apartment door which opened on the outer hall. The door that knew neither fear nor hope, she found herself thinking in paradoxical mindlessness, was their only means of escape, unless the kitchen window. "The lamp!" Bob was shouting at her. "Turn on the lamp right beside you. Pull the cord." It was at that precise instant that she found her voice. "No!" she screamed, not moving but letting the protesting words emerge from her throat without restraint. "I don't want to see it. No lights! I don't want to see it!" Rosalie never did. Within 2 seconds of her hysterical outburst, her husband lifted her from the floor and simultaneously overthrew the standing lamp in the hope of stalling the progress of the monster. Now, in his mind's eye, he could see it clearly. What he had described to Rosalie as a mere pinpoint of living matter had been a morsel of pig fetus, 1/4 of an inch square, an area ample for the spread and swift development of the activating fluid. He knew that if Rosalie once looked upon the result, she would, in all likelihood, never have another night of peaceful sleep. So he jabbed at the kitchen window with his elbow while Rosalie clung to him in a hush of horror. He heard one more thump behind him just as he cleared the sill and gained the rusty iron fire escape. He clattered down, shouting hoarsely, unintelligibly but loudly enough for a neighborhood policeman to come at a run. Not much later, the fire department entered from the fire escape, their weapon a great hose spouting water. One fireman fainted dead away at sight of the pink-hued, pig-resembling mass perched on the kitchen table. Another, of hardier stuff, simply directed the flow of water in a concentrated stream at the monster until it was helpless. He captured it in a net and triumphantly toted his catch to the station. Bob Miller, not long after, recovered his scientific detachment and was able to view the captured specimen quite clinically while a brilliant idea for exploitation burgeoned in his mind. He became a lecturer. Nowadays he tours the country accompanied by his prize, securely imprisoned in a heavily wired cage. Speaking before august groups of scientists from all over the world, he points out astonishing humanoid similarities in the configuration of the jaw and forehead of the monster. Bob has gained a reputation in the field of scientific research on mutation, and Bob has become rather smug. Sadly enough, the idyll of the Millers is declining. Rosalie is not happy, in spite of wearing mink and living in a fine house. Could there be a moral in all of this? A caution against mutation experiment? A warning that the line between honest exploration and delving into the monstrous is too thin for ordinary comfort? Could some unspeakable instrument of vengeance be lying in wait, patient, purring, biding its time until more scientists yield to the temptation? After all, it is such devilish fun to play God.
The end. About the author. This Ethel G. Lewis, birth unknown, death unknown, is a bit of a mystery. A one-shot wonder or a pseudonym? There does not seem to be any information about this specific author to be found online, or it might simply be a case of the proverbial needle in the haystack of namesake Ethels and Lewises. In the introduction to one of her stories in the original magazine, she speaks about having a son that reads science fiction, so that should place her in the 30-something and up age range. Maybe. So anyway, this story is one of 4 credited to this name, all published in Fantastic Universe in 1955 and 1956. This story was extensively researched and no evidence has been uncovered to indicate its U.S. copyright was renewed. The text is therefore deemed to be in the public domain. It has been painstakingly transcribed by yours truly and is destined to be made into a free ebook for the world to enjoy. Do you want to know how you can help save more such stories? Go to storiesoffuturespast.substack.com/about.